Okay, we are on Lamed Hey with base 35b. And yesterday we opened the floor to some thoughts about a discussion. He had homework. Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon describing a different manner in which the text of the Torah was written on the stone, intended for the nations of the world to come and have a look. Rabbi Yehuda's view that they cover the stone, they write the Torah on the stone itself, cover it in plaster. God grants wisdom to the nations. They send their scribes who break through the plaster, copy the text, and considering that they didn't, and bringing the text back to their people, and considering that they didn't follow, this sealed their fate for purgatory. Version 1. Version 2 is Rabbi Shimon, that they wrote the text on the plaster to begin with. And at the end of the text, they included the phrase that indicates that putting aside those who are in the land of Israel, anyone outside the land of Israel is welcome to repent and join us. And woe unto that day, or woe unto them that, had they done teshuvah, they would have been part of it. They would have been accepted. And it's too bad they didn't. Maybe they still can. Two versions, very different versions as the relationship between the Jewish people and the world around us vis-a-vis Torah. So the Gemara still has a few comments on this discussion, which we'll get to today. But I'll tell you what my thinking is. The Gemara, perhaps what's being discussed there is dealing with the fact that it's part of Torah's mandate to the Jewish people that we be a light unto the nations. That's part of the mandate. And it's something that we as Jews have struggled with since we received the Torah. Because along with that mandate to be the light unto the nation, comes jealousy. Jealousy from amongst the nations about our role and position in the world. And so the jealousy of the nations toward us is one element, and maybe that's not for us to deal with, but how do we react to that jealousy? That is in our control. And it's clear that Jews struggled with this all the way back from the beginning. When the Jews entered the land of Israel, the prophets, the book of the prophets is full of this. The Jewish people being enticed to assimilate amongst the idol worshippers, and the prophet telling them, you got to come back. This is not the way to go. And then war breaks out before. The Jews are banished to the land of exile to Persia. And again, there's intermarriage. Ezra's fighting that. The Jewish people come back to the land of Israel. There's Hanukkah with the Greeks and the Jews Hellenizing. Right? The Jews are banished from there. And, the history of our exile is not necessarily so pretty. So how are you supposed to, call yourself a light unto the nations? And when you're dealing with jealousy, you're dealing with you're supposed to proudly convey the message when the world wants to kill you. What do you do? So there are two attitudes here, I think, and I perhaps obviously they're both true, and perhaps depending on the era and the time, the attitude would be different. So Rabbi Yehuda's view is you write the Torah on the stone, and you cover it in plaster. Meaning to say, you have your Judaism etched in you, in the stone, in who you are, but then it's concealed. You put a protective layer around it. You put division, a wall, a self-imposed ghetto between you and the world around you. Now, as for the message getting to the non-Jewish people, not my job. If God wants that, he'll do it, which is how the narrative goes here. God gives wisdom to the nations that they should come break the barrier of the clay of this plaster and get to the text. And then that seals their fate. That's the way the Buddha describes it. Because we have our Judaism, we protect it. And if God decides that the nations of the world are to come to attack us because of it, that's between God and them. God seals their fate. God inspired them to come find this, and they misappropriated it. That's their issue. As far as we're concerned, we have the Torah. We have a protective layer around it, the plaster. Right. A more cynical way, perhaps, to think. Sorry.
Besides, they already refused the Torah.
Yeah. There seems to be a parallel narrative to that in some ways. Another angle to think about the same thing is, perhaps it's a different way, alternative way of thinking about this, is the Jew is afraid of displaying his Judaism for fear of it causing jealousy, and thus covers it in plaster. And therefore it's a mistake in theory. And sorry?
Go ahead.
Yeah. And the old expression goes that if a Jew forgets he's Jewish, the anti-Semite will remind him. Right? So the Jew covers up his Torah in plaster, and God sets the circumstances as such that nations of the world will come and break right through their plaster and remind you who you are. Alternative reading. Right, so one reading, I'm giving two alternative readings. One is we're protecting our Judaism, not putting plaster around it. And if God decides the nations need to see it, then God will inspire them to break through the plaster, and that'll seal their fate. If they decide to join or not, that'll seal their fate. But not our job to intervene. An alternative reaction is the Jew concealing his Judaism, putting plaster around his Torah. And you do that trying to conceal your Judaism, God will send the nations of the world to remind you you're Jewish. And this was the attitude for most of exile, probably most actually, of the exile, depending on where you are. Attitudes of either assimilate, conceal the Judaism, that way we'll be okay. That didn't work. Or the other attitude being insulate. Also didn't always work. But maybe it was perhaps appropriate during certain times, during certain eras, when the world's not ready to hear the message. So you have to protect it. Then you have Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says, display the message loud and clear on the plaster on the outside, and include a line that invites everybody to do teshuvah and join, because we have a message to the world. Now, if only they would actually hear the message, it would be so fantastic. And maybe they still can. He doesn't describe anything about sealing fate. He teaches you that if they were to do teshuvah, maybe we accept them. As if to say, maybe they still can. Display your Judaism proudly, openly. Tell the world you have a message for them, and that's why you're chosen. That's why you're light of the nations. That's why you're different. Not concealing anything. And perhaps one day they'll do teshuvah. It's perhaps another attitude. Now, the reality is, Rabbi Shimon leaves it open-ended. It doesn't say it's a guarantee that the nations of the world are going to listen to the message. He says if only they were to listen to the message, we would accept them, and they would be, or God would accept them. God would be happy with them that they heard the message that the Jew has to share. Meaning to say, this isn't a guarantee against the anti-Semitism either. And don't blame the victim for being victimized. Don't blame the Jew. Well, anti-Semitism is happening because you're assimilating, or anti-Semitism is happening because you're insulating. And this was kind of an infighting that happened pre-war Europe, before the war, pogroms and whatnot. The isolationists say, oh, you assimilators, you're causing anti-Semitism. And the assimilators, the Enlightenment would say to the insulators, you guys are causing anti-Semitism. So if only you guys would assimilate. In reality, it's just the way God wants it to be. And it's just the way it is. But Rabbi Shimon is perhaps giving an alternative attitude and saying, look, you have your job. And your mission is to display the message of being a light unto the nations proudly. Do so. And if only they'll heed the call. You can't control their heeding the call. But you can control your displaying the message proudly. Not insulate, nor assimilate. Neither version of covering the plaster. Of putting plaster on top of Torah, either because you're trying to protect it or because you're trying to hide it. Neither of those versions. You display the Torah on the plaster facing the outward. And proudly displaying that message to the world. And if they take it, good. And we hope they do.
They also break it.
And that's what I was also thinking about. In Rabbi Shimon's view, why have plaster at all?
Sure.
Just put it directly on the stone with no plaster. Why have plaster at all? So I was thinking about that. And maybe what that means to say is the Jew has a message to the world. And if the nations don't listen to the message and they destroy it, therefore the Jew is destroyed? Nope, his rock still stands. Who the Jew is at the core still stands, even if the plaster upon which the Torah is written is destroyed by the nations of the world. Moreover, perhaps what's being said here is, this is something Rabbi Lee talks about all the time, that Torah and mitzvahs don't make us Jewish, they reveal our Judaism. So the Torah and mitzvahs that we do is that the rock that we are be expressed outside of the plaster. But if the plaster is not there, if the Torah is not there, the Jew is not the Jew, the rock is still there. Maybe that's what's being conveyed here. Right? The rock being the Jew himself. Right? The first version, the rock is the Jew himself. That's where his Torah and mitzvahs are. Cover it with plaster, either insulate or hide, two variations. Whereas the second version is, you're a Jew, you're a Jew, you're a Jew. You have to express it in Torah and mitzvahs and express it to such a point that the world can see it. Whether you do or you don't, the rock is still the rock. And whether the nations destroy that or not, accept it or not, we hope they do. They don't. You're still you who you are. Maybe. So this is where my mind is at. And I can just press 6 there. Anyway, of course, I haven't read this anywhere. This is all just my own thoughts. So the floor is open to accept, reject, or have a variation that's different, as always.
I was thinking in terms of Rabbi Yehuda's point of view about insulating it. And I thought about it not so much as being insulated, not only from the point of view of the other nations, but also insulating it from Jews themselves. Because it said they broke the plaster and then copied it down with the
nations, yeah.
So it was not only it was an insulation to Jews themselves, and you see that in today's world. The deep study of Torah is really a very small percentage within Klal Yisrael.
Right. So the fact that
and so
it's a good point. So
that may be the insulation within ourselves, and that's the punishment was that we didn't. That it's not being disseminated. Now it is, but in those past days. It wasn't being disseminated
amongst fellow Jews too,
as freely among Yidden as it is perhaps today.
So that's a good point, and I would hesitate to blame, as it were, the Jew for that. Meaning the circumstances of exile in which they're being persecuted. It's only natural that the Jew would do that and say, look, those who are losing, we can't run and chase them, or I'm risking losing myself. Understand? Like the reason to insulate from the non-Jews is the same reason that led to the insulation from amongst our fellow Jews. It's the same thinking. Like insulate from the non-Jew because they're a threat. So insulate from the Jew who leaves because that's also a threat. It's the same thinking that comes as a result of generations of persecution. That insulate to protect. Right? I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying. I'm just adding that I think it's part of the same mentality, the same exile sort of mentality, right? Which is why I was saying that maybe Yehuda and Bashim are speaking in different eras. There are times when insulation is necessary, considering the circumstances of the universe. But the world at large today is such that display who you are proudly. That's where it's at now. That's what Shimon says. I think everyone's made this comment. I didn't read it anywhere, but someone told me this. I don't know if they ever said it or not. It's a good point either way. Where did I see it? Was it written somewhere? Can't remember. Anyway, don't quote the Rebbe on this because I said it. And I'm just telling you what's in my memory bank somewhere. There's like this line that in Europe, in the aristocratic circles of conversation, you have to justify your view, rationalize your view. In American society, all you have to do is say your view confidently. That's the American way of thinking. It's the fierce independence of the Americans that say, look, I can disagree with you completely, but you're saying it and you believe it, good for you. That's the American mentality. It's the new modern mentality, which could be is the perfect scene for the Jew to display his Judaism proudly and be that light unto the nations. Because anyone who has a confident message they believe in is listened to. That's how it is in the continental North American West. Europe is following suit, but not the same speed. There's still different thinking in Europe, but certainly here, you have a message to share with the world and you say it on TV proudly, people listen. If they don't like it, they respect what you think, even if they disagree with it, because that's the modern version of polite society. So in that sense, in our generation, as we come towards Mashiach's coming, Rabbi Shimon's view is the way to go. Whereas maybe in previous generations, Rabbi Huda's view is. Maybe it was right to insulate at the time. Maybe the world wasn't ready for that message. Even though we were told to be led into the nations, we didn't know how to deal with it for all these generations because the world state wasn't ready. But now the world state certainly is. You could be a proud Jew with a long beard and talk on television about morality and people listen.
For example, in Talmud now, aren't they including parts of the discussions about JC that were sized out in previous versions of the Talmud?
That's right.
Because of the fear of the backlash.
So use that as an example. The parts of the Torah, of the Gemara and the Rambam which talk about JC, not necessarily in a positive light, right? So it wasn't that the Christians censored us. We self-censored before the Christians even saw it, because we put the plaster on before we even got protecting ourselves from getting attacked. Which at the end of the day is we were attacked anyway because God put the wisdom into them to remind us who we are anyway, right? As he says here, even though we put the plaster on it. But you're right, today we can put these things out there, everything. Say proudly, say confidently. And if you have a positive message, people are listening. Right, so that's right. So we did this the other day also, how like the two of yous were both right, but just in different times, the chaos before the order. So maybe a similar thing here. There's first Rabbi Huda's view. That was for generations the way to go is the insulation. And now with Rabbi Shimon's view, right, and Rabbi Shimon being Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the author of the Zohar, who is a sort of messianic thinker, right? Because he's Kabbalistic, he's thinking way ahead of his time, thinking ideas of spirituality and universality in secrecy at the time, knowing that in the future time it could be in public. And maybe that's where Rabbi Shimon comes from, speaking into a futuristic, pre-messianic generation in which display your Torah proudly. You can do it now. And some nations will listen, some won't listen. We hope they do, but you can do it. And no one's going to come and no one's going to come and break your clay. In Rabbi Huda's view, they're breaking your clay. They're breaking your protective edge. Whereas in Rabbi Shimon's view, no one's breaking anything. They're listening. Maybe they're listening to one degree, not to one degree, but they can still listen. It's still available for them. No one's fate is being sealed, as was in Rabbi Huda's view, when the nations are breaking the plaster, breaking through the shell that we have our protective measure. Anyway, these are my thoughts on what's happening here. And of course, the floor is open for interpretation. Anyway, okay, let's conclude then. The Gemara's final comments on this discussion between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Huda. Okay, so it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines from the bottom. Lamed Hamid Beis 35b. Amar Rava. Rava says, Amar Rava Bar Shila, Rava son of Shila says, my time with Rabbi Shimon what is the reasoning, scripturally speaking, from where in scripture does Rabbi Shimon derive his view that the Torah is written on the outside of the plaster? So the Ksiv, as the verse reads, he quotes a verse in Isaiah describing the downfall of the nations who've been not treating us nicely. And there it says, "V'hayu amim misrafais sid." And then the nations will be burnt up. And then the word used there is sid, which actually the original text, as you can see in the sidebar here, is sid with a sin. But sin could be often interchanged with the word sid with a samach, which means plaster. So the burning is done sid, as if to say, al iske sid, because they failed to be engaged with that which is written on sid, written on plaster. So the verse says they're burnt in sid. What the verse means is, says Rabbi Shimon, they are burnt because they failed to engage with that which is written on sid, on the plaster. Rabbi Shimon's view. Rabbi Shimon's view describing the punishment on the nations to their failure for not reading the message that's written on the plaster. It's being displayed. The message was there for you to pick up, and you didn't.
What was the first line?
V'hayu am misrafais sid. We can look up the verse in Isaiah. Let's look it up. I'm looking it up right now. In a second. Let's pull it up. Isaiah, what was the verse? Isaiah 33:12. Sorry? Prophets. Here's the full verse?
No, just the
source.
Sorry.
Wait, where is it? Ezekiel, I know. No, where is it? Shea. Where's Isaiah? Why am I seeing it? Nevi'im. Yeshua Sheftim Shmuel Malachim Yeshaya. There you go. Yeshaya. 30, what did you say, 33?
Yeah, 12.
33. Verse 12. And the people shall be as the burning of lime. Lime as in plaster. Serve thorns, with fire they shall be burnt. Right? Okay, so explains Rabbi Shimon, when the verse refers to their fire as in related to lime, to plaster, it's because they failed to do that which is written on plaster.
Lime is very caustic. It burns, not from fire, but just from chemical.
Oh yeah?
It's like,
don't you make it in a kiln?
Lime.
Don't you make it in a kiln? Isn't that right?
I don't know.
You have to make it in a kiln. Isn't that right?
Lime?
Yeah, isn't that right?
Use it to, like,
certainly
mortar,
plaster you have to make.
Mortar,
yeah, so that's right. You have to dry up. You have to heat it up to make it work.
That's clay.
It's more clay, right?
You heat up. But this, I think it just
Sorry?
through the air.
I'm thinking about lime, not lime.
Lime.
Yeah,
It's very caustic.
Lime is caustic.
Lime. Both of them are caustic.
Looking up lime material. Lime is a calcium-containing inorganic material composed primarily of oxidized hydroxide, usually calcium oxide or calcium hydroxide. Is also the name of the calcium oxide whatever. Not limestone, but lime as in the inorganic material. Anyway.
Lime is caustic.
Yeah. Anyway, so the point is that the burning described in Isaiah of the nations is associated with sid, with plaster. And Rabbi Shimon's view is because they failed to do that which is written on plaster. And Rabbi Shimon's view being a text is written on the plaster itself. Okay, because it's their choice that they failed to listen to the message that was being proudly displayed. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda says, in Rabbi Yehuda's view, we can't say that they failed to do something related to the plaster because the text is not written on the plaster. According to Rabbi Yehuda, the text is written on the stone, covered by plaster. So why is there the association of their burning to sid, to plaster? Says Rabbi Yehuda, not that their burning is as a result of plaster, but kisid, their burning is like plaster. Ma sid, just like plaster, has has no other option. Ella Sreifa must be burnt in order for it to be produced. You have to produce it
like lye, you have to burn that.
This is lime with an M.
Ashes in order to.
That's right. All this kind of clay is in some version of burning. You collect the clay, you burn it, you make it into something, even to oxidize it. You have to burn it, right? To extract that.
Well, you burn, I think, wood in order to make lye.
Yeah.
Anyway,
the point is just, so, Huda's view, it's not that they failed to do that which is written on plaster, and that's why they're getting punished, as Rabbi Shimon describes it. But rather, their burning is like plaster. And that plaster has no other option but to be burnt to make it. So too, their fate is sealed, right? This is following in line with Huda's view that their fate is sealed by their being pushed to be antagonistic towards us or something like that. So too, these nations have no other option but to be burnt. Okay, final comment from the Gemara on this discussion. Kaman Ozla, in accord with which of these two views would we say Hadatanya, that which is written in the following Mishnaic text? The verse reads, the verse reads, Vishavisa Shivyoy. So the verse talks about person who go when the Jewish people go out to war, and they go out to war. So this war is they're going out. It's a war outside of the land of Israel. And there it says you can. It talks about taking the captive woman there, the law of the captive woman. During wartime, there's a guy sees a woman that he's attracted to, he can be with her, and then there's a whole process by which he can either have her convert or not. Okay, so it says this Mishnaic text, because there's a double expression, so visa shivyoin, you shall captive the captive, something like that. This teaches you that even Canaanites, who are originally from the land of Israel, who now live outside of Israel, that if they do teshuvah and decide to accept Torah and not necessarily become Jewish, but accept the Jewish message and so on, the Kabbalonites, they're accepted. End Mishnaic text. So between Abu Huda and Rabbi Shimon, who would take the statement? Well, let's look. What's the problem here? The problem here is that it's a Canaanite outside the land of Israel. In Rabbi Huda's view, all the nations of the world's fates are sealed. In Israel, out of Israel. Certainly for a Canaanite who's from Israel, went out of Israel. Which Rabbi Shimon's view is, only those people who live in Israel were told that they have to be destroyed because they are a threat to us moving there and being affected by them. But those outside of Israel, no problem. We have a message for you, and we hope you accept it. Even if they happen to have been in Israel and moved out. And therefore, come on, who would this follow? Rabbi Shimon, like Rabbi Shimon's view. So which adds another layer. Even Rabbi Shimon is of the view that the one nation that Rabbi Shimon said their fate is sort of somewhat sealed is the people living in the land of Israel, because they're a direct threat to enticing our Judaism, and therefore they're the ones to be destroyed. Whereas the rest of the world, there's a message for you, and if you want to accept it, good. Says Rabbi Shimon, if someone who's in Israel decides to leave because they don't want to be a threat to our Judaism, then they also fall into the category of those who are accepted if they decide to take the message, right? Which maybe there's a further balance here. Even Rabbi Shimon, who says, display your Judaism proudly for the world, but don't invite non-Judaism into your house. Non-Judaism meaning the home you build is a wholesome Jewish home, free of outside influence. To the outside world, we absolutely have a message. But our home remains pure. Our home remains uninfluenced by the world outside. It's an interesting sort of caveat to this, with a message to the world. Having a message to the world doesn't mean that we compromise who we are. And therefore, our home, the land of Israel, is free of any Canaanites, free of any external influences. We have a message to the world, not the other way around. Right? So whenever we talk about shlichus, about people going out there spreading the word of Judaism, and people might say, well, they're going to be influenced by the world around them, and it's going to compromise their Judaism, assimilation, and so on. Never said it to the halacha, which I'm sure I repeated here. Halacha and the laws of salting meat. One doesn't eat blood. That's the halacha. That's the prohibition. So kosher meat is salted, so it opens the pores and the blood run out. So the Gemara asks, well, if the pores are open, the blood's running out, maybe it'll run back in. So it says the halacha, because the meat is busy exfoliating, it cannot absorb. Absorb, because it's busy exfoliating. So if you're busy sharing a message, you don't have time or energy or space to be absorbing a message. Because you're on a mission, you're sharing a message. And that's the duality of the Jew who's sharing a message proudly to the world. He has to remember that I'm not part of this world. My heart has nothing but the message, no outside influences. And that message is shared with the world. But inside our own personal land of Israel, there's nothing other than the purity of the Jewish soul. And there we have a message to the world on the plaster for everybody to see, and we hope they listen to that. If they don't, maybe they'll listen to it one day.
Outside of Israel, it's more of a covered plaster.
A message to the world. No, not protective. A message to the world.
Just a message.
But inside, it's a message. It's not an interaction. It's not a two-way street where we have a message for you and you have a message for us.
That's more on the outside.
Yeah, it's a message going this way outward, not outward inward. We're not exchanging cultures.
That's happened.
That has happened. It's been a mistake. But we have a message to the world. Well, so do they have a message for the world.
You like it? Come to us.
But it's not there's no exchange of culture going on here.
No.
So the land of Israel is free of Canaanites. Right? So if you're outside the land of Israel, even if you happen to have been a Canaanite, we got a message for you. It's a universal one. Sorry?
It's full of Arabs.
You won't talk about that right now. Okay. So these are my thoughts. And feel free to share what you think. Okay, wonderful day. And God willing, tomorrow we get back to the narrative of the Jewish people crossing the Jordan under Joshua. We're still on the narrative, but we took a break to talk about the Torah written on stones because we were talking about the different sets of stones that existed. One of which was the stones upon which Torah is written. Okay, wonderful day, everybody.
God bless you, Rabbi. All the very best to you all. Have a wonderful day.
You too, Judge. All the best.
All the best. God bless.